I think people will probably be trickling in as we go along, so I think it might be time to, and might think might be a good time to get started. How do the rest of you speakers feel?
Yeah, let's do it.
All
Sure,
right,
go for it.
sounds good. Yep. Right. Well, welcome everyone once again to our IGDA Wednesday webinar. My name again is Matthew Lee. Welcome everyone to our IGDA series. IGDA webinar. My name is Matthew Lee, chair of the IGDA series Game SIG. Today's webinar is going to touch on exploring worlds of thought and play as we look at how games can be vehicles for us to explore things like tragedy, culture, and mental illness, all things that are very relevant in our day-to-day lives. This is sponsored by the series Game SIG because we talk about how games are good for more than just entertainment, how games can be useful in helping us improve our daily lives and better understanding one another and ourselves as humans. So a little bit of what today is and how today works. Webinar Wednesdays are things that the IGDA generally runs about once a month or so, or whenever their organization schedules these Wednesday webinars on topics that are relevant to game development and of interest to the game community. And so you know, this session is being recorded. You'll be able to hear the presenters. We will not be able to hear you. If you have questions, send them to us through the questions pane. And we will refer those to the presenters after they have given their talk. I'm sure you've read the description of the people who are speaking today, but I'll go over them just one more time. Our first presenter will be Kristen Sue from Golden Glitch Studios. She's working on a game called Elsinore, which takes Shakespeare's Hamlet and introduces some time-living mechanics to let you better explore the world and what goes on in there. She'll be talking about to play Perchance to Change, exploring agency and tragedy in the world of Hamlet. She'll be followed by Jacob Majewski's games and cultural heritage talk, like what do the two have to offer each other. Jacob is a long experienced game developer originally from Poland who is currently working on a PhD, I believe. And last but certainly not least will be Erin Reynolds, the creative director, or Chief Mullis, as she calls herself sometimes, of Flying Mullis. She is the great mind behind the game Nevermind, about a feedback game which deals with anxiety and stress. And we'll be talking about mental health in games. This is our contact information here in case you want to get in touch with us for the future. And if you have friends who would be interested in this topic, this webinar will be put online through the IGDA's YouTube channel at a future date. So feel free to share that with them and to invite other people who might be interested. Okay. Without further ado, I think I'm going to pass the microphone over to Kristen, who is going to start us off with a nice chat on tragedy.
Okay. Let's see. All right. Can everybody see this? I hope so. Okay. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Hello. Good day, evening, morning, depending on where you are. My name is Kristen Sue, and by day I am a PhD candidate working on human computation games at the Georgia Institute of Technology. By night, however, I am one of the engineers at Golden Glitch Studios working on a time-looping Shakespearean adventure game called Elsinore. And tonight I will be talking about To Play, Perchance to Change, exploring agency and tragedy in Shakespeare's Hamlet. So in this talk, I'm going to touch on a couple of things. I'm going to talk a little bit about literature and games. I'm going to talk about making a game about tragedy, and what are some of the challenges involved in making a game where the narrative does not necessarily, represent the kinds of narratives and stories that we're accustomed to seeing in most everyday games. So first off, I'd just like to talk a little bit about games that are inspired by literature. So like many other mediums, where people are really good at telling stories, and so literature is the written form of storytelling. We've seen it evolve into things like film, and we've also seen it evolve into things like games. So a lot of games take inspiration from different kinds of literature. We've got adventure games that look at Sherlock Holmes. We've got strategy games that look at classic Chinese literature like Romance of the Three Kingdoms. We have adventure games for sort of cyberpunk-esque worlds like I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Shadows of Mordor is an example of a game that's set in the world of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Dante's Inferno is a hack-and-slash game that's based on Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy. And then we've also got other kinds of adventure games for mystery settings, such as the Nancy Drew games. But tonight I'm going to be talking specifically about Shakespeare. And so for those of you who are not familiar, William Shakespeare was a 16th, 17th century English playwright who was writing comedies and tragedies in Elizabethan era England. And so his works are considered quintessential to Western literature, and we've seen them appear a lot in different kinds of interactive media. So just to give a quick overview of some of the ways that Shakespeare has popped up in interactive media these days. One example that is a good example of this is the interactive theatrical piece Sleep No More, which is a theater installation that takes place in a hotel in New York City. And it tells the story of Shakespeare's tragedy Macbeth, and it's played by actors throughout the floors of a hotel, and observers who attend this wear these masks and can walk around and pick and choose which events of the play they wish to experience. And so, they can go to different floors, see different scenes play out, and it's sort of up to them to decide what pieces of the piece they want to see. We've also seen this is a talk about Hamlet, so obviously I'd like to talk about examples that are related to Hamlet. We've seen things like choose your own adventure versions of Hamlet. So this is a very popular example, To Be or Not to Be, which is a choose your own adventure book by Ryan North. In this book, the reader can assume the role of characters like Hamlet and Ophelia and attempt to explore alternative fates by making different decisions at different choice points throughout the play. Another recent example is this interactive piece called the Hamlet Mobile, which won awards at the IndieCade Game Festival this year. It's a sort of interactive game where the performers drive around in a van and perform scenes from the play out of the back of their van, and based on where they'll play different scenes, and so you can try and catch them playing different scenes around different parts of the country. But for the most part, Shakespeare and a lot of other pieces of literature are not heavily explored in games, and many different kinds of narrative structures that we see in literature, which is very diverse, are not seen in games. And so what are some of the common narrative structures that we do see in games? Well, I'll give one particularly popular example, which is this idea of the hero's journey, which was proposed by Joseph Campbell, or we also know it as the monomyth. And so in the monomyth, the hero or the protagonist of the story receives a call to adventure. They're generally unskilled, they're in a comfortable situation, and they are immediately thrust into a series of tribulations where they meet mentors and helpers and encounter challenges and are faced with some sort of climactic event that here is labeled as sort of the revelation or the abyss. They undergo transformation, they go through some sense of sort of atonement, and then they return and they're successful and they're empowered and they have completed the journey. And we see this pop up in a lot of games that are, especially AAA titles these days, so games where the protagonist starts out particularly unskilled, is thrust into an adventure, and is asked to save the world. And as it turns out, this kind of structure works very well for power fantasies and games that give the player a sense of empowerment. So to reiterate, empowerment is very pervasive in games, and it turns out that it's because players respond very well to success stories. We like stories where, as an ordinary person, we can go explore a world or explore a narrative where we, through the player character, are allowed to grow and do amazing and great things that we're not necessarily allowed to do in the real world. And as it turns out, the mechanics of games tend to map very nicely to the structure and the flow of the hero's journey. So as I mentioned before, there's the narrative flow of many of these games maps to what we just saw on the previous slide. There's also this idea of skill progression or leveling systems, which are very common in role-playing games. And, you know, the idea of becoming stronger or attaining more skill or, you know, getting smarter, richer, better, all of these sort of fit this, this narrative archetype very, very well. But, you know, this isn't all the kinds of narrative that are out there. So what about other forms of narrative that may not necessarily fit this mold, and how do we design games for them? So based on the title of my talk, I'm obviously going to talk about tragedies. So tonight, let's talk a little bit about tragedy. So to start off, some of the oldest forms of tragedy is a very old sort of structure for telling stories. It dates back to the ancient Greeks. Aristotle defined a dramatic arc to represent different kinds of pieces of different kinds of narratives and pieces of theater that were being performed at the time, and it looks something like this. So the general flow for a piece of theater, or be it comedy or tragedy, that was performed in something like ancient Greece starts out with an exposition. This is where the characters and the setting are introduced. Next, there is generally some inciting incident that galvanizes these characters into some kind of action and kicks off the drama and the plot of the play. A series of events occur in what we call the rising action, and they all culminate in sort of the climax of the play. So this is the most intense and dramatic moment of the narrative. The fallout from this is a series of events that we call the falling action. Oftentimes this slope is particularly steep, especially if things go very quickly. And then at the end of this is the denouement, which is sort of the time for reflection and the summary of everything that has happened, and sort of the point at which characters look back at everything that's been done, and, you know, we reach the conclusion to the narrative. So as I mentioned, this is the structure that works for both, you know, comedies and tragedies. For tragedies, we can change. It's a little bit different, but fairly similar. So the arc of drama remains relatively the same, but the climax is now often some point of plot reversal, or this is the point where perhaps the protagonist makes a fatal mistake, or the protagonist experiences some kind of misfortune, and the falling action is the series of events that fall out from this. In tragedy in particular, the ancient Greeks liked to use this sort of moment at the very end as a moment of catharsis or reflection. So it's here, you know, as the audience is encouraged to reflect on what has happened in the play, they are given time to sort of empathize with the characters. This is where the summary occurs. And this is what you know makes tragedy so compelling. It's a point where we can sort of just sit back and we say, you know, think about how we relate to the characters, what has happened, you know, what this sort of taken the summary of the entire play. So jumping ahead, you know, hundreds of years to Elizabethan England, when William Shakespeare was writing tragedies, many of his tragedies also follow this very similar arc. Oftentimes we see this moment of catharsis is actually a monologue told by one of the characters who happens to be alive at the end of the play. And so this is the point where, you know, the audience is given the summary of what has happened, and, you know, oftentimes the protagonist has passed away and someone else is sort of lamenting about the loss. So let's talk a little bit about Hamlet. Many of you have probably been exposed to Hamlet either in your high school English class or some college literature class, but for those of you who are not familiar, Hamlet is one of Shakespeare's tragedies. It's one of his most famous. I believe it was the fourth most popular play of his time, and one of several that was not a sort of historical, particularly historical tragedy. Hamlet is a prince of Denmark, and he begins the play in the Danish castle of Elsinore. He is very melancholy because his mother, Gertrude, has recently married his uncle Claudius after his father has passed away. Claudius is now the king. His mother is still the queen. And the inciting incident of the play occurs when a ghost of his father appears before him and says that he has been was murdered by his uncle. So this incites a series of events in which Hamlet interacts with characters such as Ophelia, his ex-lover, Ophelia's father Polonius, and tries to figure out what to do about the situation and how he should take revenge on his uncle. Through a series of misfortunes, characters end up dying, so he accidentally stabs Ophelia's father Polonius. Ophelia is driven mad by grief and then is found drowned in a pond later. And all of this culminates in some kind of climactic duel with Ophelia's vengeful brother Laertes, who works together with Claudius to try and get rid of Hamlet. And this results in a series of events and a duel and a lot of poison where everybody dies. And the end of the play occurs when, unfortunately now, most of the main characters have passed away. Hamlet's friend Horatio is the only remaining character left, and he monologues to a passing prince named Fortinbras, who is passing through and sort of learns the story and what happened to this Danish noble family. So in making this game Elsinore that I'm going to be talking about now, we wanted to take Shakespeare's Hamlet, which is a game about tragedy, and explore tragedy in the form of a piece of interactive media. So this is a short video of Elsinore. So as I mentioned before, Elsinore is a time-looping Shakespearean adventure game. It is a point-and-click adventure game in real time that is viewed from an isometric perspective. Players take on the role of the character Ophelia. And so in this video that you're seeing right now, which the game begins in Act 2, Scene 1 of the original play, Hamlet is raving madly in Ophelia's bedroom in the morning, and after he runs out screaming some nonsense, the player gains control of Ophelia and is allowed to wander through this castle. We've condensed the play into about 3 or 4 in-game days, during which Ophelia walks around the castle, is allowed to interact with other characters, acquires information about what's happening in the castle, and then can use this information, which we call hearsay, to try and talk to other characters in order to affect what's going on. And so in this particular example, she's talking to her father Polonius, and Polonius is reprimanding her about seeing Hamlet run out of her bedroom, and she decides to tell him that Hamlet was behaving very strangely, and so then Polonius responds accordingly, and this can potentially change some events that might happen. So if Ophelia does absolutely nothing and just wanders around the castle for 3 days, then the events of the original play will play out as they did before. As I mentioned before, this game has time loops in it, so sort of after 3 or 4 days of tragedy play out, the player will be subjected to a particular ending based on the events that have transpired thus far. And then once they have sort of witnessed this, they're allowed to rewind time to the first day while keeping all of the information that they've acquired over the course of these past couple of days, and they can then use this information to try and change the events that have occurred in a different way. So, oops. All right. So what does this look like? Well, as I mentioned before, this is a real-time game. It is part hand-authored. It is part narrative simulation. The screenshot here shows it's a timeline of what all the characters are doing, in this case the first day. So as Ophelia wanders around the castle, she can encounter different events, and this is just sort of a visualization of the different kinds of events that she can encounter. All of the events that are currently in black are events that Ophelia has seen. And so, and then based on the information that she passes back and forth between the different characters, this timeline will change and different events will play out. So this seems like a very complicated system, and so how did we get to this, and sort of what were the considerations that went into designing a game like this? So we wanted to make a game about narrative, so one of the first things to think about was how did we want to author a game that was based very heavily on a famous piece of work while still making it tenable to actually accomplish. So just a very quick overview of the different kinds of authoring approaches to narrative games. Right here we have I'm going to talk a little bit about a scale of the different sort of approaches to authoring content in games and the representations that are used. So sort of on one end of this scale we have this idea of hand-authored narrative. So we see a lot of games like choose your own adventure games or visual novels or games like The Walking Dead, where all of the different interactions are authored by hand. And some of the pros of this approach are that you have a lot of authorial control. So you can ensure that the quality of every possible path through the narrative and thus through the game meets some kind of standard or quality bar. The cons are that it requires a lot of hand authoring, especially if you want to give your players a wide range of options to pick from. And you have to enumerate all of these in advance, which is incredibly difficult and requires a lot of people to be writing a lot of stuff. On the other end of the spectrum, you have this idea of simulation with what we call emergent or emergent narrative. And so one really good example of a game with emergent narrative is the game Dwarf Fortress, which is a simulation game about raising a colony of dwarves. And so the player can do lots and lots of different things in this space, but the most interesting stories that come out of this are the stories that you see people posting on the internet about how they raised a fortress and a lot of unexpected things happened, and then it all collapsed, or it went particularly successfully. And the pros to this approach are that there's a little bit less authoring to do because you're basically building a big simulation and you get to define the rules, but not necessarily each individual combination of actions. And so you have a wider range of interactions for players to interact with. The downside to this is it's very hard to control. If you want to try and create a story using a simulation that maps very nicely to some kind of narrative or dramatic arc, this is extremely difficult. So ideally, you want to be somewhere in between, and a lot of different pieces of interactive fiction and interactive narrative have tried to address this. So games like Facade or systems like Versu. Facade is a game about trying to mend a relationship between two friends that you are recently meeting up with again. Versu is a system for describing social simulations in different social scenarios and sort of allowing characters to have interesting interactions in this particular space. And we'd like to think that Elsinore is trying to also combine both the nice qualities of hand-authored narrative and simulation as well. And so I'll go into a little bit more detail about what this means, but this was sort of what the kind of feel that we were trying to get at when we were designing this game. So we wanted a game that had the quality of a Shakespearean piece of literature, but we're a small studio and we obviously couldn't author lots and lots of content or even enumerate all of this up front. So, and we still wanted to provide the player a lot of actions and the ability to sort of explore tragedy and explore the space of tragedy in a way that was not confined and constrained to discrete choice points. So I've talked a lot about tragedy. I also want to bring up this idea of agency. So one of the things that makes tragedy very compelling as a piece of as a narrative structure is our ability to sort of empathize with characters in unhappy situations. So tragedy involves this, as an observer, tragedy is sort of characterized by the inability of the observer to intervene when characters are making bad decisions. So if I'm watching a piece of tragedy, I empathize with the character in part because I cannot stop them from being subjected to misfortune or from making a terrible decision. And so when thinking about how this might translate to game mechanics, one thing that sort of comes up is like, well, this might encourage us to try and stop the player from doing certain things. However, there's also this concept of agency, which in fields like interactive narrative, some people believe that offering players and observers and people interacting with the systems more things to do is better. So agency in this case is all about giving the player the ability to interact in as many ways as possible, which sort of potentially flies in the face of trying to make a game where we're trying to limit the kinds of interactions that the player is having with these systems. And so a lot of the difficult design decisions and challenges that we faced in trying to adapt Hamlet to a game were this conflict between keeping consistent with this theme of tragedy while allowing players some kind of agency, but not too much agency. So I'd like to highlight for the rest of this talk 3 different design challenges that we encountered while trying to design a game for both tragedy and agency. So first I'll talk a little bit about designing around this idea of limited agency. The second thing that I'll talk about is why we selected Ophelia as the protagonist, particularly because the play is titled Hamlet, and the play is mostly about Hamlet. And then we also wanted to remain consistent with this tragic arc that I described before. So how do we ensure that we have moments like these moments of reflection, like catharsis, through things like the mechanics of multiple endings? So let's first talk a little bit about how we tried to design for limited agency to ensure this sense of tragedy. So what are the mechanics? So as I mentioned briefly before, the player is allowed to move around this castle as the character Ophelia, and Ophelia can pretty much talk to other characters. She's also allowed to pass on this information, which we call hearsay. So this particular screenshot shows a sort of a menu between Ophelia and Hamlet, and all of this information that's listed here is information that Ophelia can potentially talk to Hamlet about. And over the course of multiple time loops, she acquires more of this information and is allowed to present it at different points of time. But, and so this is how one might be able to affect a system like this. But we specifically consider it to be a form of indirect control over the events that transpire. And how does this work? Well, characters maintain models of their mental state. Characters who are not Ophelia, that is. So, Hamlet has certain emotions. Hamlet has certain things that he wants, and this holds for all of the characters. And as I mentioned before, we tried to strike this balance between purely hand-authored narrative and simulation, and where the simulation comes in is we have a gigantic scheduling algorithm behind the scenes that's basically picking what events happen based on what characters currently know. And what they know is based on what kinds of hearsay Ophelia has presented to them. So as an example, we might be in the situation where at some point in time, Hamlet believes that Claudius is guilty, and Claudius feels like confronting Hamlet. So the system will decide, okay, we have this hand-authored scene where something will happen. All of these preconditions are met, so this scene will play out. The result of this scene is now, unfortunately, maybe Claudius is killed as a result of this scene, and then this will change the state of other characters in the system. But the important thing here is that this isn't a discrete choice point. At any point in time, Ophelia can go up to another character and present an information that might change this. And so this scene can occur potentially at any point throughout the 3 days of the play. And so this is very different from a branching narrative with discrete choice points at certain points in time. And so yes, the player can manipulate characters by changing their mental states by passing on hearsay. The other thing, though, is that in keeping with the tragedy, characters may not always behave reasonably. And what does this mean? Well, a lot of the gameplay over the course of these many loops is watching characters do very, very horrible things. So let's say that the player has gone through one loop of the game. They've watched everybody die. They know now that Claudius is in fact responsible for killing Hamlet's father. And so Ophelia might know, well, maybe I should, the player might think, well, maybe I should tell Hamlet something pretty early on, that, Hamlet, I think Claudius might have killed your father. And so if this were any other game, you might expect a pretty reasonable response to this. So Hamlet might say something like, no, you're crazy. Like, where's your proof for that? And that seems fairly reasonable. In reality, to remain consistent with the idea that characters have fatal flaws, Hamlet's reaction is more likely to be, great, I'm going to take this information and do something absolutely awful with it, which is not reasonable. So a lot of the writing and the design that has gone into making this game work and to sort of reinforce this idea of tragedy is that in spite of acquiring all this information, in spite of making progress and uncovering these pieces of hearsay, just because you have it, that doesn't mean that by giving it to other characters, they're going to behave in ways that will try and potentially stop bad things from happening. So yes, players have control to change events, but when they talk to characters is important. Depending on how characters feel, different events may transpire because they're feeling differently at different points in time. What they talk about is important. So yes, you can try and tell someone that so-and-so poisoned someone else. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to behave in the appropriate way for it. And so over the course of these many time loops, you get more and more information. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will be able to stop all the terrible things from happening just because you have it. And in many ways, this helps to enforce this sense of limited agency in the game. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about why we went ahead and selected Ophelia as the protagonist. So to reiterate, as I briefly talked about Ophelia before when I was talking about the plot of Hamlet. Who is Ophelia? So Ophelia is Hamlet's love interest. You may be familiar with these many different portrayals of her. She spends a lot of the play being pushed around by her father, being manipulated by nobles of the court. Hamlet verbally abuses her at many points during the play. She ultimately doesn't do very much, and then 2/3 of the way through the play she goes crazy with grief after the death of her father, and Queen Gertrude reports that she has been found dead in a pond, which triggers many of the climactic events involving her brother later. So why pick this character who has why pick this character who doesn't do very much, is pushed around by a bunch of other characters, doesn't have a very large presence in the play? Well, as I sort of alluded to before, a lot of what makes tragedy compelling is our ability as the audience to empathize with a lot of these characters, and so it's very much about the observer as it is as much about the characters who are participating in the narrative. So Hamlet is the central character of the play, and his decisions, or inability to make a lot of them, are what drives many of the tragic events of the play. And as the observer, we can't do anything to stop him. In fact, if we sort of stepped in and said, Hamlet, no, you shouldn't do this, then many of these events might not happen. So the framing that we pick for the observer, and through the observer, the player character, should probably also emphasize that inability to choose and affect the characters, because we want to explore tragedy. We want to encourage players to explore tragedy. And so Ophelia works in part because she is what we consider an invisible protagonist. She doesn't have a lot of presence in the original play, and so we've taken this and we've flipped it around. And this sense of invisibility is what lets us use her as an effective player character. So Ophelia can walk around and she can observe events. She can listen into conversations. And because her role in the play was so minor, it's very minor here. But this is very different than if we had, say, used Hamlet as the player character. If we had let the player wander around as Hamlet, well, Hamlet is the Prince of Denmark, and so everybody would immediately notice that he was present in all of these events that were happening. So he might walk into an event where Claudius is plotting to kill him, but that's not natural, because Claudius would immediately presumably stop talking about what he's planning to do. Whereas if Ophelia just sort of walks into this event and nobody cares about her, then Claudius can continue monologuing. And so in addition to the many other reasons for wanting to explore Ophelia as a protagonist and sort of looking at tragedy from different points of view, we found that this was a really effective way to sort of enforce this idea that the observer is really important, and that we want the observer to be able to see all the different things that are going on in a way that feels extremely natural. And we do it by using a character who in the original play did not have a lot of agency or did not have a lot of ability to affect what was going on. Okay, so last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about how we try to continue to stick to this idea of the tragic arc, and sort of what are the mechanics in place that allow players to sort of reflect and think very deeply about tragedy and sort of explore it through different endings. So this is a narrative game, and as I showed, a lot of the examples earlier are games that have multiple endings or different results based on the choices that you make. So Elsinore has a variety of different endings, and each of these endings is conditioned on the kinds of the events that have transpired throughout the 3 to 4 days that the player has played through that particular loop. And one of the things that we've tried to emphasize in exploring this is that we want to explore tragedy, so we want to explore lots of endings that are not necessarily always good, but we've structured them to be based on different trade-offs and values. So players who make choices about the things that they want to explore, like I want to explore scenarios where I try to keep everybody alive, or scenarios where I keep only my family alive, or I don't care what so-and-so thinks of me, I'm going to try and save this particular person. All of the onions are structured around these kinds of decisions. So I'm going to give some abstract examples. Obviously, I can't talk about real examples because that would spoil a lot of the game. But one example might be, well, a player might decide that they don't care about remaining friends with all their relationships with all the other characters in the play. They just want to gun for as much power and be as ambitious as they want. So you might have a scenario where Ophelia teams up with Claudius, and this could result in an ending where Hamlet dies and Ophelia seizes power. Maybe she could even become the queen in this particular scenario if, say, Gertrude was not there. And to contrast that, we also have endings where things like, maybe the player decides that they really want to keep Ophelia's family alive. So in this particular ending, sacrificing your dignity for your family, it might be possible to, keep Polonius and Laertes, both of whom die in the original play, alive. But the consequence might be that, oh, you're exiled from the castle forever, you've lost all standing, and this is the exact opposite of what happens in this other ending where you've seized power but, traded it for all of your friendly relationships with the other characters in the process. A couple of other things that we've done to sort of capture this idea of like exploring different values and allowing time for reflection. I mentioned before that a lot of Shakespeare's tragedies and their moments of catharsis are characterized by these monologues told by characters who are still alive. And so we basically use the same kind of structure for all of our endings, and unfortunately I can't show you any of them because that would be full of spoilers, but players are given explicit time to reflect on the endings that they've encountered. And then we've paired this with, I mentioned before we have these time-looping mechanics. So players don't necessarily need to commit to a particular ending. They can replay endings and try and sort of figure out which ones they like, which ones they don't like, and come to a conclusion about what values are important to them. So it's like, do you care about family? Do you care about seizing power? Do you care about your social standing? And all of this contributes to this core theme of tragedy. So over the course of many loops, we're allowing players to explore tragedy in different forms with different sets of values. Okay, so those are sort of three design challenges and sort of like three aspects of designing this game that all revolve around this idea of tragedy and sort of the conflict it has with player agency. And some of the takeaways for this are, adapting literary structures that are unexplored in games don't always fit nicely into what we consider, commonly used game design. So tragedy does not map very nicely to this idea of the hero's journey or the monomyth. And so we sort of had to be a little bit creative about how we designed this game because we wanted to make tragedy work, and we did it by taking away or sort of working around, playing with this idea of like tragedy and agency. So we deliberately picked a character who had very limited agency in the original play, but works very nicely as an observer who can experience a lot of things that are going on, as opposed to picking a character like Hamlet. And we also limited the kinds of interactions that players were allowed to perform to passing information around and indirectly controlling what events could transpire as a result of this. We tried a lot of different mechanics. So original prototypes had things like allowing players to kill other characters in what was basically a murder simulator. We tried, different kinds of information. We tried, sort of point and click adventure, like lock and key style puzzles. And through playtesting, we found a lot of these ideas to be very distracting. And so much of this got streamlined by limiting it just to information, which again fits very nicely with this idea that, as Ophelia, you're a character who can't do very much, and the most you can do is talk to people. So that's precisely what you do in exploring this tragic space. You talk to people, and you use that information to try and change things in ways, hopefully, so that characters don't all end up dead. So to summarize, you know, I think there is a lot of room to explore literary works using games as a medium. And some of the questions that are worth asking are, you know, what point of, you know, let's say you want to adapt a piece of literature to a game. And so what point of view does the player have, and or do they even occupy the role of a particular character? And so, you know, for something like the hero's journey, it seems pretty obvious. You probably want them to be the protagonist. But in the case of tragedy, we found that exploring other viewpoints turned out to work very nicely, and this gave us a much closer sense of, you know, the player character is more like an observer as opposed to an actual protagonist in the space. Other things are, what kinds of agency do you allow them to exert? You know, common wisdom dictates that, you know, you probably want to give them as many actions as you can because you really want them to explore a different variety of actions in the space. We found that we tried to remain consistent to this theme of tragedy as closely as possible, so we wanted to capture the theme. We wanted the game to still be playable, but we still wanted to limit the kinds of actions that they could perform. And even though that seemed a little bit counterintuitive, it turned out to work really nicely and really emphasized the tragedy, this theme of tragedy that we're trying to play around with. So ultimately, you know, why should we care about, you know, trying to adapt literary works and different kinds of literary works to games? Well, unlike other forms of medium, games are interactive, and they allow us to interact with literature and things like theater in novel ways. And as games become more ubiquitous, we have much larger audiences who are willing to try these out, and so this gives us a really good audience and avenue to try and expose, you know, literature that has been underexplored or may not seem particularly interesting to many more people. However, this may not always necessarily fit to like what we know about designing narratives for games. So a lot of games, you know, use things like the hero's journey, and so I think there's definitely an opportunity to try and explore adapting different kinds of narrative structures to games. And yes, as I mentioned before, this is all unexplored and delightful. So I just want to finish with two questions, which is, you know, if you took a class in high school or in your college literature class about Shakespeare, chances are, you know, you were probably asked to watch some particular film adaptation of something like Hamlet. So these are examples of film adaptations of Hamlet from the past couple of years. And so now I want to ask, you know, what about experiencing it through a game? Wouldn't it be nice, you know, one of the things that we found in making Elsinore is that we never intended it for it to be a game that would be used in classrooms, but one of the most common questions we get when we show the game off at conventions and different festivals is teachers will come up to us and ask, can I use your game in my class? And we say, well, it wasn't intended for a class, but we're happy to let you use it. And I think, you know, as a high school student or a college student, playing games is a way to get students very excited and potentially very engaged. And I think there's a lot of room here to try and make games and simulations that allow students to explore what students often consider very uninteresting pieces of narrative in much more interesting ways. And the next sort of question is, you know, what other kinds of literature can we explore with games? Are there narratives that do not necessarily translate well to mediums like film that we can explore through interactive versions of games? So I'll leave you with those questions, and I hope that many of you are inspired to hopefully try and make games about literary and theatrical works. Very quickly, I'd like to give a shout out to the rest of my team members at Golden Glitch. I love you all. I love making this game with you, and you're all wonderful people. And I am happy to take questions. If you're interested in looking at Elsinore or contacting us about any of it, our contact information is there. My contact information is underneath. I'm happy to talk about Elsinore or any of my other related serious games work. So thank you, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Kristen. That was a very interesting presentation. I very much enjoyed it. So I believe next will be Jacob talking about games and culture and what they have to offer one another. Jacob, whenever you're ready.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Hello? Yep, okay, good. Yeah, I was just having some difficulty with this, but it seems to be working out. Okay, yeah, so hopefully my network will not cut out too much while I'm talking, because it's been a little bit glitchy. But yeah, so I'm going to be talking about games and culture. What have they got to offer one another? Well, actually, a lot of the question has already been answered by Kristen, which is, if we're talking just about literature, then there's already a lot that games can do with literature. And so I guess I'm just going to be making that discussion a little bit wider by talking about this broader concept of cultural heritage, which includes many, many other things beyond literature. So first, a few words about myself. I'm kind of assuming that most of the audience here are game developers, so let's just say that like most of you, I used to be a game developer, and I plan to be, again, a game developer in the future. But right now I'm working on a PhD at Bond University in Australia, and my PhD explores using open-world RPGs to transmit and to explore Australian Aboriginal cultural heritage. So that's how I ended up taking an interest in the ways that game examine cultural heritage. And just very briefly to explain cultural heritage, this concept, it's a word that we hear quite a lot, but nobody ever really bothers to explain it because it's one of those all-encompassing things. Cultural heritage is all about pretty much any historical cultural stuff. And we'll just leave it at that for the moment. We'll get back to a stronger definition of it later. First, why are cultural heritage practitioners interested in games? So why are people who are interested in looking for ways to preserve or recreate historical cultural heritage, why are they interested in games? Well, that's very easy to answer. That's because cultural heritage, even if we're talking about preserving a building, there's a lot of value to be had in creating a virtual version of the building so that people can look at it. In many ways, in many cases, this can be used also to help protect a building from damage. One of the famous examples is the ancient, medieval Inca ruin of Machu Picchu in South America, which is receiving so much damage just from tourists coming and visiting that a virtual version of it was created a few years ago explicitly to encourage people to visit Machu Picchu virtually and not damage it by going there and simply being there. But this presentation today is going to be mainly aimed at game developers. So an important question here is, what's in it for me? If I'm a game developer, what's the benefit of being interested in cultural heritage? And I'll get back to Kristen's presentation just for a moment here because I think that's, you see a lot of the answer there. Imagine Kristen's Elsinore game not as an adaptation of Shakespeare Hamlet, but just as a completely new story set in a castle in a fictional fantasy universe with a bunch of characters that were created for that experience in particular. All of a sudden, with all respect to the very interesting narrative structure that Kristen has shown, and talked about, all of a sudden that game starts looking a lot less interesting than it does when we're talking about it as an adaptation of Shakespeare Hamlet. So simply by taking a work of literature and using it as a baseline for a game, Kristen's team has already gained a leg up in terms of world building, in terms of thinking about game mechanics as well. And again, game mechanics are going to be one of those issues that I'm going to be talking about quite a bit in this regard. Just looking at Kristen's Elsinore example, we can imagine that somebody would do what Visceral did with Dante's Inferno, which is to take Hamlet and to turn it into a bloodbath, a third-person action game. Somebody could do that. It's conceivable. And we can see immediately that it would be a lot less interesting as an adaptation. So that's going to be one of the big issues that I'm going to be discussing. So with that intro aside, the plan for this presentation is firstly we'll talk briefly a little bit more about what cultural heritage is, what role does it serve in video games. Then we'll talk about what is wrong with the way that we do things right now. What is wrong with the way we handle cultural heritage in so many games such as Assassin's Creed, such as Skyrim, all these other games. And we'll focus in particular on two case studies. The first one being Far Cry Primal and the second one being Never Alone. Then we'll talk about what could be done to improve the way that we work. We, in particular, meaning game developers, although to some degree also experts, scholars, historians, art historians, archaeologists, anybody who's dealing with cultural heritage as well. And then we'll conclude, hopefully, on a very positive note. But there's one thing that I want to be very clear from the start that we are not going to be talking about. I am not going to be saying that developers should be forced to listen to experts who know better. This is one of those attitudes that you see quite often in academic writing on this topic. And I think that this kind of attitude where academics try to tell game developers what to do it's worse than just merely being wrong. It's actually useless because game developers have no reason to listen to academics. To obey them, I mean. They have plenty of reasons to pay attention to what academics are saying and to draw lessons from what they are saying, but they have no reason to obey them. So the moment anybody starts talking about what game developers should do or should even be forced to do, that's the moment when people start ignoring them. Okay, so cultural heritage. This is a very, very broad concept, and it can be divided into two different fields, or, well, two subfields. Firstly, we have the tangible cultural heritage, anything that we can touch, we can hold with our hands. So buildings, historical items, whether it's costumes, weapons, machines, anything at all like that. Then there's the intangible. So these are stories, literature, music, dances, language, even ideas, cooking recipes, memories of historical events. All these things are in some way cultural heritage. And all of these things are considered worthy of preservation by at least some people, although very often these are very contested concepts, and that one person's heritage will often be considered somebody else's trash, something that not only does need to be remembered, but in fact should be obliterated from memory. But that's a discussion we don't need to get into. So cultural heritage scholars and practitioners are people who examine cultural heritage, and they usually seek to firstly document objects of cultural heritage, then they seek to preserve it if at all possible, and if this is not possible, then they seek to reenact or recreate cultural heritage, and very often these days they are looking at virtual ways of doing this, so looking at video game technology, and not just video game technology. VR, for example, doesn't necessarily lead to video games, but is a very good technology to use for preservation of heritage. And the interest in games from cultural heritage is quite obvious and natural in that games are the most dynamic form of of digital interactive media, and they are very good at putting the audience in the role of a participant, at immersing them in a particular world. Which is very, very good when you're trying to get people's attention, which is also what Kirsten was saying about the difference between exploring Hamlet by watching a film and exploring Hamlet by playing a video game. One little caveat here, there's a reason that the word preserve here is written in quotes, because if you recreate a building in a video game, or if you recreate a place or an event or anything like that, well, you're not really preserving anything. You are recreating a digital copy of it, but you're not really preserving the original as such. Now, interestingly, even though there's been quite a lot of interest from cultural heritage practitioners in terms of looking at games and looking at ways that games can help them reach a wider audience, so far the track record of these efforts has been relatively poor, because game developers, because cultural heritage practitioners tend to ignore certain aspects of video games, but we'll deal with that in a moment. Now, in terms of games and cultural heritage specifically, games and cultural heritage are obviously inseparable in the sense that any video game with any form of narrative will have some attachment to real-world culture. So anytime, whether it's, even if it's a completely fantasy game, it's still going to be dealing with real culture in some way or another. And this means that potentially, if we're talking about games that use cultural heritage, we could go to the extreme of saying, well, all games use cultural heritage, so let's talk about all of them. But that would be pointless, because most games don't use cultural heritage in a meaningful way. Obviously, merely including content that could be considered cultural heritage does not mean that you actually value cultural heritage and that you are presenting it specifically to transmit it to other people. Very often culture can be used as a kind of replaceable form of window dressing for a video game. And I think a really good and powerful example of this is the Assassin's Creed series, which actually does a very good job of showing off different cultural settings, different historical settings. They put a lot of work into recreating the architecture, the unique feel of a place in a particular time. But at the end of the day, you're still an assassin running around on buildings, on top of buildings, and focusing on killing people. So not only is there a limit to how much culture can be explored, but also there's this sense of replaceability that, yes, this particular Assassin's Creed game takes place in, for example, Victorian London, but it could just as easily take place anywhere else, and the game developers are not that interested in Victorian London as such. It's just a convenient background for this particular story. Why does this happen? Well, cultural heritage obviously is very valuable when it comes to world building, when it comes to building the background to your game, to the world that your game is set in. So from this perspective, we game developers value cultural heritage quite a bit without ever really even talking about the concept of cultural heritage. We see it as a source, as a place where we can go to find useful things to put in our games. Memorable events, memorable people, memorable places, all these things. For us, very often cultural heritage is a mere selling point. Now I say mere selling point, but I want to stress that this is not a criticism, that we use culture as a selling point. There's nothing wrong with trying to be profitable when you're making a video game. Obviously most game developers produce projects with their own funding, or at least the funding of a publisher. They need to be able to demonstrate that their project is going to be profitable. So there's nothing wrong with using cultural heritage as a selling point, but we can do more than that. So how do things go wrong between games and cultural heritage? I would argue and that's really the main message of this presentation, is that the conversation between games developers and people dealing with heritage is very superficial on both sides. So on the side of heritage, you often see this kind of approach in amongst academics. Look, how hard could it be to make a game like World of Warcraft? We'll just try to do it on the cheap with, you know, $200,000 or whatever a budget an academic can scrape up for a project. The results of such efforts are obviously not that interesting, or to put it more brutally, they tend to crash and burn utterly. In which case you haven't really succeeded, or haven't succeeded at all. In the best case scenario, when a game like this is released, it kind of disappears into the void in the sense that it doesn't find an audience because it's not an interesting game as such. On the game side, we twist our subject matter to suit our needs. This is the Dante's Inferno case, where an incredibly deep and beautiful work of medieval literature is boiled down to basically an extended action game. There's very little interest in Dante's Inferno in the subject matter itself, and there's very little interest in changing the game in such a way to better suit the subject matter. On the heritage side also, there's a constant concern about violence. For some reason, people tend to think that games contain a lot of violence. I'm not sure exactly why this is the case, but it seems to be. Now, this is obviously not entirely unjustified as a concern, but it also leads heritage people to ignore the things that games do really well. And you know what, if we're talking about history, there is a lot to be said in favor of having violence in a game that explores historical settings, because there's usually going to be quite a bit of violence involved. Now with games also, the other thing that goes wrong is that heritage experts are hired very often for background info. So Assassin's Creed, again, Ubisoft does work with historians. They ask historians for input about what kind of weapons were used in a particular time, what would the city have looked like in that particular time, all these kinds of questions, but it would never really occur to most game developers to ask about advice on what the game itself should actually play like. And this might again seem quite reasonable. After all, people who, you know, a historian is not an expert in game design. What would they have to say about game design? But potentially that could be quite a bit, provided that we explain to them a little bit more about what we are trying to achieve. So let's move on to two case studies, the first of which is Far Cry Primal, a game set in 10,000 BC. And it's quite an interesting game in that, in spite of obviously being a fantasy game where you can even ride around on a saber-toothed tiger and you can use your magical powers to remotely control an owl that helps you in combat. In spite of all these fantasy elements, the game does try to recreate to a certain degree an actual historical setting, and a very interesting and unique historical setting at that. And it does it relatively well in terms of the environmental details. At the very least, there's no dinosaurs involved here, which is, you know, if we're talking about a game set in prehistory, that's at least something to be thankful for. One of the most fascinating aspects of the game is the language that was recreated by experts for the purpose of the game. So you have obviously not a preservation, but a reconstruction of what Proto-Indo-European languages might possibly have sounded like. In terms of the artifacts you see in the game, it's also not a bad visualization of Mesolithic material culture. It's a game that archaeologists actually talk about and use to discuss the Mesolithic. So again, it's one of those cases where a game that was created purely for entertainment finds its way occasionally into academic settings. But then things start going wrong, because if you look at the gameplay of Far Cry Primal, it is ultimately just like every other Far Cry game out there. I really like a video review done about Far Cry Primal by a YouTube blogger who goes by the name of Super Bunny Hop, or George Weidman is his name, and he talks about his sense of wonder initially when he started playing Far Cry Primal, and this idea that somewhere in Ubisoft somebody stood up at that meeting looking at different ideas, and they actually said, let's make a game set in prehistory, and he wasn't thrown out of the window, he wasn't shouted down, they actually went for the idea. But as he played the game more, this sense of wonder gradually dissipated into this great disappointment that, you know, at the end of the day, they really didn't have to do very much with this game to make it to produce it in terms of making it more adapted to the historical setting. It's just like every other Far Cry game out there. For example, the material culture in Far Cry Primal is such that you collect lots and lots and lots and lots of stuff. That's not the history of a prehistoric setting. As far as we know, the average person in those times would have been very happy to have just one good weapon, and they would have struggled to obtain all those different, to kill so many animals as you kill in Far Cry Primal, and to obtain so many different items from animals. And this means, this amongst other things, also they would not have a mini-map. All these things mean that the setting itself is basically wasted. It served as a marketing wrapper ultimately. So a good question here to ask is, would players really have hated Primal if it had included more Primal gameplay? If it had tried to make us feel more like, you know, what would it really be like to live in those times? What would it really be like to have an action hero? Yes, we're still playing a video game and it's still a fantasy, but set in those times where you have to really you know, merely moving around the space, you should really be looking at landmarks rather than at dots on a mini-map. So much more could have potentially been done here. Now, the other example worth looking at today is Never Alone. And this is a game that was done specifically for the purposes of cultural heritage. In fact, it was developed by a game developer, but it was developed in very close collaboration with the Cook Inlet Tribal Council in Alaska. So it was developed with the funding and with the direct collaboration of the Inupiaq community, whose cultural heritage the game actually explores. So in terms of ways that we can collaborate with cultural heritage organizations and experts, this is almost a showcase for how we should be doing this kind of thing. And the game has been very widely praised for its visual style, for its cultural content. It hasn't been that widely praised for its gameplay, but we'll get to that. And in terms of the success it has achieved for cultural heritage, we can look at it this way. There is only about 13,500 Inupiaq people in the entire world. It's a very small community. And now their heritage has reached 400,000 people through this game. Imagine how long it would take for that to happen if we are talking about each member of that community going out and talking to people about their heritage. And it goes further than that, because many other people have not bought Never Alone, but thanks to the game's publicity, they have heard about it, and they would have taken some interest in it. Never Alone is also a good example here of an indie game which has gained commercial viability by looking at a unique subject. So we can imagine an indie game just like Never Alone, the exact same gameplay, but set in a more typical setting. You know, instead of having a little Inupiaq girl exploring this fantasy version of Alaska, we could have a little New Yorker girl running through the streets of New York. And it probably would not be anywhere near a success. But that's also the weakest link in terms of what the game does, because the gameplay itself, you know, you really could just replace the whole setting with New York and and the game would still be the same. So the gameplay as such has basically as much to do with Inupiaq culture as as all the Super Mario games have to do with plumbing. The game does contain lots of additional content which then lets you explore the culture, but the gameplay itself does not do it. So in terms of the key problems that are encountered with heritage in games, here's just a few quick takeaways. Firstly, heritage-oriented games tend to divorce gameplay from culture. So culture is used to inform the background. It's not used to inform the gameplay itself. Now, it may be that what's happening here is that somewhere behind the scenes there's a trade-off that's being made from a business perspective, that, okay, we're going to be making a game in a unique cultural setting, so that's a risk, so let's not compound that risk by having really innovative gameplay, which is undoubtedly a reasonable point to make, although arguably not always. So we do see many innovative gameplay experiences out there, but usually not in cultural heritage games. They usually tend to play it safe. Elsinore being an exception, I would argue, although I haven't played the game yet, obviously. Now we'll notice that this argument that I put forward about cultural heritage, it does not happen with other types of serious games that explore subjects besides cultural heritage. So, for example, no one ever would suggest creating a platform game to teach about nursing anymore. At least it used to happen probably, but not anymore. And of course, the devil's advocate response here is also that, you know, no one would actually try to make a nursing game and sell it to the broad public. So in this aspect, cultural heritage games are a bit different. So a key part of the problem, as I've suggested, is a lack of deep conversation between one side and the other. So heritage experts are very happy to harness game technologies, but they are often wary of what it means to embrace gameplay from video games as such. They don't want to end up trivializing the subject matter. They don't want to fall to what has actually been called by academics the Indiana Jones syndrome, where you create a game that explores a historical setting, but at the end of the day you've also trivialized the whole subject, in the same way that the Indiana Jones films have trivialized archaeology into something involving bullwhips and fedora hats and shooting at lots of Nazis. So the devil's advocate argument here, of course, will be that if this is the only way that we're going to popularize cultural heritage, then maybe it's better not to bother. But that's a very pessimistic view, I would say. Game developers, on the other hand, are very happy to talk to experts when it comes to the content, when it comes to the background materials, but they don't talk to heritage experts about gameplay. And the devil's advocate argument here is, of course, that cultural experts, if you ask a historian about gameplay, they're not going to have a very informed answer. But again, that's probably a very limited view. Also because many historians these days are gamers themselves. So I argue that in both cases a deeper conversation can produce lots of mutual benefits. And there's one important prerequisite here, which is that we have to understand both sides of in this conversation, we have to understand that content equals gameplay equals content. Now what the heck does that mean? Many of us in games development would have somewhere along the lines heard that famous, during our studies at least, we would have heard that famous quote from Marshall McLuhan, the communications scholar, that the medium is the message. In other words, the medium that we use to convey a message strongly influences what the message is going to be itself. And in video games, this has been translated by Ian Bogost into the concept of procedural rhetoric, which is quite simply this idea that we are conveying messages through gameplay itself. A brilliant example of this is the game Papers, Please. Now, having come from a formerly communist country, I can say that this game is an incredibly deep exploration of what it meant to live in that kind of environment uh, uh, where you know very often you face these day-to-day choices. Do I collaborate and keep my family fed, or is this the line that I will not cross, but I will get fired in the process, and what will happen to my family then? These are very real choices that are faced by very many real people, and I think Papers, Please did a brilliant job of exploring this, not through the story of the game, but through the gameplay, by putting the player in a situation where he or she had to make these choices constantly, and over the course of the game, as you keep making these choices, and the whole thing starts escalating, you can then start to finally understand something that most other media would struggle to explain, which is why did so many people put up with these awful repressive political systems? Why did they collaborate with the system? And you know, were they evil to collaborate with the system? And in most cases, it was a case of simply trying to survive. And it's only when you play a game like Papers, Please that you are able to get that. And all games, at some fundamental level, do convey some message through their gameplay. It's just that we usually don't think about it too much. For example, the Assassin's Creed series, apart from being just an action game set in various historical/fantasy settings, it also contains this kind of classic revolutionary doctrine, this idea that individual lives are worthless in pursuit of higher ideals. The game pounds this idea into you constantly by allowing you to pretty much do anything, kill anyone in order to achieve your objectives, and still feel good about it because, hey, you're working for the good guys, apparently. Far Cry Primal and most other games also have this element of procedural rhetoric where a person's worth is basically the stuff that this person carries. So it's not about the ability, it's not about your abilities, it's about the equipment that you have. Often, because we don't tend to spend enough time thinking about these things, this leads to a very kind of conflicted form of rhetoric in our games. So, for example, the Elder Scrolls has you. One of the aims of the player in any Elder Scrolls game is to collect wealth, to accumulate wealth. Except as you keep playing the game, over time you suddenly realize that there is no point in accumulating wealth in the game. Because in fact there is nothing of value in the game that money can get you, because all the best weapons, all the best items, anything that has any significant value are things that you can find somewhere in the world and obtain by defeating monsters. Whereas the things that you can only buy with money, including housing, strangely enough, are so incredibly cheap that they cost next to no effort to obtain the money needed to obtain these things. So you have this strange situation where the surface kind of value of the game is you should be collecting wealth, you should be trying to become more important in this world by accumulating wealth, and then as you look deeper into it, you realize that actually the game is giving the exact opposite message. What about Never Alone? What kind of procedural rhetoric does Never Alone contain? Well, it actually does have a very vital bit of procedural rhetoric, which would undoubtedly be very important for the Inupiaq people, which is that you never go out alone, which is, oddly enough, the exact same message that the movie Top Gun tried to convey, which is that you never ever leave your wingman or you will die. So Never Alone does this just through a very different means, where you have to collaborate, where you have to cooperate between the Nuna, the little girl, and her white fox. But could there have been more than this? Could there have been more in the sense of not having the gameplay come down to merely solving typical platformer puzzles? I mean, what message do these platformer puzzles convey about the skills needed to survive in the Arctic? Fundamentally, I would say this is a non-message. basically the game is saying that in the Arctic, if you're one of the Inupiaq people, you need to be able to run, to jump, and to solve puzzles. And because we immediately recognize this as a standard platform game mechanic, we reject it as information about the Inupiaq people. We reject it as in the sense that we don't think that we have really gained any knowledge about it. Even though the game does occasionally have you doing things which convey important information about trying to survive in the setting, like, for example, trying to duck out of the way of gusts of strong wind. But potentially you could have had a much deeper level of knowledge being imparted in this game by having a gameplay experience that teaches the player to value Inupiaq skills by making the use of these skills critical in the gameplay itself. Whether the skills that would be tapped here would be, for example, hunting, or it would be merely the art of navigating through this barren snow-based landscape. That's something that I don't want to go too deep into, this kind of speculation, but we can imagine so many different ways that this experience could have been enhanced simply by looking more at those skills. So how would we go about doing this? And again, I want to reiterate this point I said at the start. We're not talking about coercing one side into listening to the other side, whether it's academics listening to whether it's game developers listening to academics, or academics listening to game developers. Games are about entertainment. That's their key strength, and it is important at all times to keep that in mind. And very often it would be very much counterproductive for a developer to try to make a game that's less entertaining just for the sake of being more culturally authentic, even though technically that's what serious games very often try to do. But since we do value cultural authenticity in video games, as a selling point at least, it is important to ask the question is, why should we be important to using culture for world-building content? Why not also use it for gameplay? So getting back to Never Alone again, this is, as we said, a textbook example of collaboration between an organization of the Inupiaq people in this case and game developers who made the game. So we can imagine that there must have been quite a bit of back and forth conversation about this game between the game developers and the Cook Inlet Tribal Council. So questions that might have been asked is, what kind of story would you like us to tell? What kind of game should we be making, perhaps? But I think that this conversation probably didn't go quite as deep as it could have. And some questions that I think they should have been asking, and just looking at the game, my impression is that these questions were not asked, is what is the core experience of being an Inupiat? What do the Inupiaq people value? What do they do in their daily life, or what did they do traditionally? How do they live now? How did they live traditionally? And of these things that the Inupiaq do and value, which of them would work very well in a game? So what was it that you did that was difficult? What was it that was boring and repetitive and would not make for good gameplay? So what is the kind of core gameplay mechanic, if you can put it that way, of being an Inupiat? These questions, I think, just having that conversation would have opened a lot of new possibilities. Possibly it would have involved also the game developer initially explaining this idea of procedural rhetoric and explaining the idea that the gameplay itself is the message, but that's obviously a step well worth taking. Now, moving, as I'm just about finishing up now, so in terms of potential outcomes, we can see that already Never Alone and Far Cry Primal are both very interesting games in spite of their limitations. And the same applies to many of these other games that showcase cultural heritage. Whatever their limitations, there's so much talk about Assassin's Creed, how much it has done for interest in architecture of medieval Florence, or interest in in revolutionary America and all these other settings that have been explored by the game. Skyrim has been widely praised for its exploration of Nordic culture, even though it's a fantasy game which takes ultimately very little of Nordic culture, but merely playing that experience has raised a lot of interest. But both sides can definitely benefit a lot by making stronger use of the other's expertise. Developers, and I would say especially indies, so if you're an indie listening to this, this is well worth thinking about. You can find unique gameplay experiences by talking to heritage experts, by talking to historians, by talking to archaeologists about what things were like in a particular setting, or by looking at literature, of course, as Elsinore shows us. Heritage practitioners, on the other hand, can also find stronger ways of telling their stories by engaging with game developers and by talking more about this idea of procedural rhetoric and by understanding better what it is that games can actually offer. How awesome can the results of this kind of collaboration be? Well, we'll just have to see in the future. But just as my last word on the topic, I want to point you to two different projects. One is a forthcoming game called virtual world called Virtual Meanjin, which explores Aboriginal Australia. It actually recreates Brisbane before European arrival. But as you can see on the screenshot, it's a game that fundamentally uses the same gameplay mechanics that many other games do, like World of Warcraft. You have a mini-map, you have your objectives, and you go with that. On the other side of the screen, you see Firewatch, which is a game that probably most of us have at least heard about. And Firewatch allows you to move through a forest and to navigate through a forest almost by relying on landmarks. Yes, you can look at the map, and you can have a navigational marker in the game as well, but the game becomes really interesting when you switch off that navigational marker and when you start moving through this world trying to rely on landmarks. And all of a sudden you're in a much more interesting setting. And the way I see this, as great as Virtual Meanjin is, and it really is a fascinating and amazing looking project, I would just love to have its creators sit down and talk with the creators of Firewatch and trade notes on what works and what doesn't work. So that's basically all for today. Now, unfortunately, I do have to leave straight at 1 p.m., so I probably will not be here to take questions after the presentation, but if anybody does have any questions, my email address was on the first slide of this presentation, so you're very welcome to contact me and ask questions then. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Quite a fascinating talk on culture and case studies on a couple of games. All right, last but certainly not least is Aaron Reynolds of Flying Mullis, who will be talking about mental health in games, which is something we all need to keep in mind as being something quite important these days. Aaron, over to you.
Great. All right, let me see if I can get this up and running. All right, can you see that okay?
I'm not seeing anything right now.
Let's try that again. Whoops. How about now?
Yep.
Okay, great. So full screen, good slides, you can hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this webinar series. I've really enjoyed the talks so far, and I think you'll find that a lot of what I'll be talking about echoes much of what Kristen and Jacob have already spoken to. So it's exciting to see how a lot of these ideas kind of converge, even though they're coming from very different angles. Yeah, with that, I'm excited to wrap this up with a talk about exploring mental health in games. So to start, I'd like for everyone to indulge me in a brief visualization exercise. So just bear with me here. Okay, oops, there we go. Okay, so to start, imagine, if you will, a game where you just stomp your feet. Sometimes you stomp one foot, sometimes you stomp the other foot, sometimes you stomp both feet, sometimes you don't stomp any feet. It's a lot of stomping, it's a lot of great exercise, but at the end of the day, stomping isn't a whole lot of fun. Unless you make the players feel like a dance superstar. So you put fun music in the background, maybe you add a point system, you have some awesome gnarly visuals, maybe a little bit of narrative. Basically, you know, you make the player feel like a total dance badass, and it's this really fun experience. Okay, so next visual.
I hate to interrupt you, but your screen is not sharing.
It's not sharing still? Oh, weird.
No.
Let's see. Let's go back. Okay, how's that?
It's shown up now.
Okay, great. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so yeah, here's a preview of the screens that you guys missed. And now we're moving on to this screen for our next visualization exercise. So I want you to picture a game where you get to listen to hundreds of people complain. You get to balance taxes. You even get to analyze data by looking at various charts and stats and weigh the pros and cons of things like solar energy. It's like adulting the game. And, you know, maybe you learn a lot about how infrastructure or civics work, but, you know, let's be honest, adulting isn't really all that fun unless you're the mayor of your very own city. Give players the power to make mistakes, feel amazing building an incredible ecosystem, wrestle with real-world issues and dilemmas, and have fun ruling the world. Okay, so final visualization exercise. I want you guys to close your eyes, take a deep breath, and put yourself in a position where you're playing a game in which players have the name of a horrific digestive issue forever ingrained in their brains. So, who here doesn't know what dysentery is? I think it would be safe to at least casually assume that many folks who were born in the 80s and had access to educational computer games knows exactly what dysentery is and knows that it is no laughing matter. It's really quite serious business. And so these are just a few examples of some of the more classic games out there that some folks might be familiar with already. You know, there are games that allow you to walk in the shoes of others, live a story, and have an experience. So the point I'm trying to make here is that we can do so much good with video games. Is an amazing ability to provide context, intrinsic motivation, and appeal to a variety of let me back up and add appeal to a variety of otherwise bland or even uncomfortable issues, especially in the areas of promoting mental wellness. So whether that is by either creating games that contribute to the player's own mental wellness or experiences that help promote more of an understanding about mental wellness or mental health issues, or even both. So this talk will cover my team's approach to trying to make a game that actually does touch upon both promoting player wellness as well as educating players about mental health topics. So, just a little bit about me. I'm Erin Reynolds, and I'm the Chief Mollusk and Creative Director of a very small independent development studio called Flying Mollusk. And Flying Mollusk is most well known for a game called Nevermind. Nevermind is a biofeedback enhanced adventure thriller game. In it, you play as a neuroprober. And a neuroprober is sort of a psychologist of the not too distant future who can go inside the psyches of people who have experienced psychological trauma at some point in their life. So these are folks who, you know, had this awful event happen to them, and their mind just couldn't really process the events, and so as a result, it's completely repressed the memory, buried it deep into the deep into their subconscious. And as a result, even though the patient, or we call them the clients in the game, can't consciously recall what happened to them or even that anything happened to them at all, it still finds its way to manifest itself in their day-to-day life and have a negative impact on kind of just daily life. And so in the game, the idea is that these clients come to you to help them, and you go inside their subconscious mind, into their psyche, and you put together the fragmented pieces of these buried memories. You try to figure out what happened to them, what the trauma story is. It's really a mystery game in many ways. And when you are able to put together the story of the trauma for each individual, you sort of release that memory, and then the idea is that the client can then really own it, recognize it, work with professionals through it, and sort of start repairing the damage that was done by the traumatic event. So the trick with Nevermind is it's a very surreal, dark, creepy, intense game at times. Again, you're in the subconscious mind of people who have experienced a really soul-shattering event in some way, shape, or form. And while you're encountering these really intense situations and scenarios, if you play with one of our supported biofeedback sensors, the game can pick up indications of feelings of stress, fear, anxiety, and will respond in real time to those feelings. So, and it'll get more punishing the more stressed you might be feeling. So, for example, you might go into a room and you see that the room looks a little nerve-wracking, and all of a sudden you start to kind of feel a tightness in the pit of your stomach, and then you see on the screen it's getting staticky and milk is flooding the room, and the whole world, the game world, is becoming more chaotic. Now you can either sort of let those feelings build and the game will just become more intense and more punishing, or you can take a deep breath, you can think about the beach, you can look at cat photos, that's what I do, whatever works best for you to kind of calm those feelings on the fly. And if the game can pick up on that, it'll in turn respond by becoming easier and relaxing. So the milk will drain out of the room, the screen will clear up, and there's different effects in different parts of the game depending on what level you're in or what area of the level you're in. But the idea is that it helps players become more mindful of those everyday feelings of anxiety and stress, and gives them an opportunity to practice managing those feelings on the fly so that the skills that you develop in playing Nevermind are ones you can take out into the real world. So we launched Nevermind on Steam for Windows and Mac back in September of 2015, and it now supports a number of off-the-shelf heart rate monitors for physiological biofeedback, so things like Apple Watch, things like Garmin Cardio Chest Strap, and we also can detect emotion-based biofeedback via any standard webcam using Affectiva's Emotion SDK, which is really cool tech, so it can read sort of micro facial motions and determine how the player might be feeling based on that, again, through any standard webcam. And we also very recently released a version of the game for Oculus Rift. So just for a little bit of context, here is the trailer for the game. All right. So that's never mind. And
the audio
can you hear me?
wasn't playing for the
Oh,
trailer.
it wasn't. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. Well, if you guys want to see it with the audio, it's online. You just go to our website, and so I hope you all enjoyed that moment of silence with a pretty slideshow. Yeah, so in creating Nevermind, we really had three goals. One was to help promote player wellness, and this is through the biofeedback functionality. We wanted players to, as I mentioned before, have an opportunity to become more aware of feelings of anxiety, stress, and fear that might, manifest, in the game and then, out in the real world, and practice managing those on the fly and kind of learning and getting good at whatever technique works best for them. We also wanted to help create an understanding and awareness around trauma, psychological trauma, specifically in PTSD. I think through the narrative themes of the game, it's an area that I think many people are aware of, certainly, but I think a lot of people think of PTSD, they think of combat PTSD, or maybe sexual assault, and those are certainly, important areas of it, but it's a much broader topic than I think a lot of people realize, and so we really wanted to bring awareness to that and destigmatize it by placing the player in the role of helping people who have experienced a traumatic experience and kind of providing education embedded in the narrative that way. And then, of course, we really want to make the game compelling. My philosophy is that the game can't help people if they don't play it, so we really wanted to make sure that it was an experience that people would seek out and want to engage with in its own right. They would see Nevermind as a quote-unquote traditional game and want to play it for fun, and then sort of these other two goals were kind of snuck in as part of that experience. Again, in terms of mental health, there are really two angles that Nevermind wanted to tackle, helping improve wellness of the player by sort of generating mindfulness, and then in education, trying to create an awareness and understanding around the topic of PTSD and psychological trauma. So Nevermind actually started out as my MFA thesis at the University of Southern California back in 2011. And even from those very early days, there were a few principles that we still adhere to today in the current development. And the first one is that we really wanted to make sure that all the topics we approached were done so in an authentic way. First and foremost, we wanted to make sure that, the way we approached things like PTSD, things like psychological trauma, even some of the themes within the individual levels, that they were being presented in a way that's respectful and responsible and as accurately portrayed as possible. Obviously Nevermind is a little bit of science fiction. You can't, with current technology, you can't go inside the minds of people yet. But we really wanted to kind of intermingle the two. So, for example, the narrative premise of people who've experienced a traumatic event, sort of repressing those memories and forgetting about them, but them having still an impact in their day-to-day life, and the individual really being able to work through them only by coming to terms with it, recognizing it, and kind of owning it, and working through it with assistance, with a professional, with help, is actually based in one thing that can happen when someone experiences a traumatic event. So that's sort of an authentic approach, kind of married with the sci-fi aspects of the game. And I say truth is more interesting than fiction because we found that adding that authenticity actually helped make the narrative more interesting in many ways. It broke us out of sort of the cliches in some areas where we attempted to kind of go down that route. So that was really important. We really wanted the game to be a positive experience, and there's two parts to this. One, I say better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick, because we really want to help. We really want the game to benefit players. But there needs to be a lot of very rigorous research that needs to go into it to be able to determine for sure just how much, if at all, the game is benefiting players. And we have lots of anecdotal data, and we have lots of, or we have some preliminary academic research into it as well that both seem to indicate that it does have a positive effect, but there needs to be a lot more testing in a more academic, rigorous environment to know for sure if it's truly helping people and how. So we want to minimally, in the absence of that hard, concrete evidence, for it to at least sort of have a good chance of benefiting the players. And again, we have lots of anecdotal data that people play it and they do feel more mindful coming away from it, so that's great. The other side of that is it's really important for us, it's always been really important to us that we make sure people know what they're getting into before they go into the game. So we really don't want to do more harm than good, of course. So when dealing with topics that Nevermind does, and some of the levels can be very intense, we try to make sure that people know what they're getting themselves into so that folks don't find themselves in the middle of an experience that they don't want to be a part of. And specifically maybe people who have experienced a traumatic event or are living with PTSD. You need to be sensitive to players who are coming into your experience from all angles. And so we really wanted to make sure that it was a positive experience on all fronts, and not the opposite. And then, of course, we really want to make the game as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. So when we took the student project that was started in 2011, which was really sort of a proof of concept, and decided that we wanted to turn it into a full-fledged game starting in 2013, it was important to us that we could bring it to as many platforms as possible. So that was really what encouraged us to want to bring it to Mac, to Windows, of course, and we're in the process of bringing it to Xbox, and then to support as many sensor technologies as possible. So, it was important to us to try to make sure we could have as many off-the-shelf sensors link into the game as we could, so that people wouldn't have to go out and buy some additional technology in order to experience the biofeedback with Nevermind. You can play it without biofeedback, but again, one of our goals is to have this biofeedback sort of stress management tool. So it's better with that. And so we endeavor to support Apple Watch, things like the Meal wristband, and then of course with the Affectiva technology, anyone with a webcam can now engage with it. So those were really kind of our core principles going into it. Now, a lot of those are easier said than done, and I want to spend a little bit of time speaking to each of the challenges, because I have a feeling that if anyone's tried to make a game like this before, hopefully you can empathize with them, and if you're thinking about making them, maybe this will be helpful. So starting with expertise, I am not a psychologist. I'm a game developer. And going into a game like this that did have such strong narrative ties to psychology, and as well with the biofeedback ambitions, it's really important, that we wouldn't let our ignorance get in the way, I guess. And I think this is a common challenge in creating games that either mean to address player wellness or to educate players about mental health issues, or really it's a common challenge, I think, in any serious game, as kind of alluded to in some of the earlier talks, is that, to create something like this, you really need to know a lot about both the game development and the subject matter in many cases. And so because Nevermind started out at USC, we're very, very fortunate to be surrounded by a number of experts who are incredibly generous with their time and knowledge and talent, advisors, faculty members, staff, on campus, off campus. And so, we had the opportunity to really bridge that gap in knowledge by speaking with many individuals who really kind of helped guide a lot of it. And so to that I would say that, you know, as a developer, you're not responsible for knowing everything about everything, of course, but you as a developer are responsible for recognizing where you're not an expert and making sure you meet and speak with folks who are knowledgeable in those areas. So, you know, again, we were able to overcome that challenge pretty well because of our circumstance, but for those who are thinking about making a game like this and find themselves in a similar challenge, I would encourage you to also reach out to any experts you can find. There's a lot of great resources online. People are usually very eager to kind of help collaborate on something like this. So I think that's a really kind of fun way to do that. Okay, so another common challenge that I think many serious games face, and certainly Nevermind was no exception, is balancing the fun aspects with the beneficial aspects. So I call this slide "Eat Your Vegetables" because I kind of like to think of it as putting cheese on broccoli. I don't know about you folks, but I hated broccoli as a kid, and truth be told, I still don't like it. But if you put some, you know, nice ooey gooey cheddar cheese on it, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. You know, you have a really great dish that's better than the broccoli alone, certainly, and better than the cheese alone, certainly. It's magic. And I feel like games are really very similar in that sense, where when you combine the fun and sort of the good for you part, the educational part or the beneficial part together elegantly, you can have something really magical, but it's really hard to do. So how we approached it is we studied as much media as we could that addressed some of the topics that we're looking at. And that's, you know, games, movies, books, TV shows, art, fine art, and really thought about what did they do well, what did they do respectfully, what did they do accurately, what did they do poorly, what was you know, not so fun, what was fun, what was compelling, what was interesting, and kind of looked at all angles and really try to learn from that and grow from that. And you know, I think it sounds maybe like a simple thing to do, but for us it was incredibly helpful and I think really helped us sort of encounter that challenge. So you may notice that I'm using a lot of Sesame Street images, and that actually started out as a coincidence. But, you know, I think the old Sesame Street, at least, and maybe the current version, but to be honest, I haven't watched it since the 80s, so I'm not sure, actually really did a good job of finding this balance. For example, I don't know if anyone recognizes this from Sesame Street. Apparently this is called the pinball number count video. And it was this animation that was like a minute or two long, where you follow this pinball around this crazy, trippy world. And every time it would hit like a goal of sorts, there would be this song that would count from 1 to 12. And it was just beautiful. It was trippy, which I guess I'm kind of into, you know. But it was really, I mean, it was really cool. It was really well done. It was really interesting, and I think I was just so mesmerized by it that I sort of absorbed the counting aspect of it, and I think I learned how to count to 12 from this video. And so, you know, I think if you haven't seen this video, then you probably have no idea what I'm talking about. But again, I think the old Sesame Street shorts like this did a really good job of kind of showing what that balance could look like. And I think a lot of games, a lot of us can probably learn from those. So I can speak a lot more to sort of that process of us trying to find that balance. I can speak to it more like during the Q&A if you're interested. Yeah, so, but move on to the next challenge. So funding was a challenge. I think funding is a challenge for everything, isn't it? So we've had some amazing partners and opportunities to build out the commercial version of Nevermind. And the commercial version is what I call the version that's currently on Steam, that's currently released right now. And those partnerships are really important because they gave us the chance to prove that making games like Nevermind, games that are mainstream worthy and successful, but also explore mental health topics in serious, mature ways, can be done, can be made, can be released, and that's great. But our ambition, even from day one, was not only to create you know, the mainstream version, as I mentioned earlier, but but we also want to create a version of Nevermind that could potentially be used in a clinical setting, that you know, a version of the game that could maybe potentially help people who have experienced psychological trauma and are working through it, or people who have PTSD, or people who maybe have clinical anxiety. Our gut feeling is that there's potential there, and we've heard this from others, that there is an opportunity there. But to really pursue that, you know, we want to build a research version of the game so that we can endeavor to perform more research and study of is Nevermind effective? If so, then how? What parts of it specifically can we make it better? Is there stuff that can be applied to other games? You know, and then from there, you know, work with partners to develop out this clinical version. It probably wouldn't be exactly like the commercial version. It probably needs some modifications, some specifications to be appropriate and effective in that setting. However, I'm sure all my fellow developers out there who are listening to this knows that the kind of thing I'm describing is ultimately a non-trivial amount of work, and it's something that we as a very small indie studio just don't have the resources to support by ourselves. Now, a lot of work like this is you know, a lot of work with these kind of ambitions is funded by things like grants. And this part, I'm speaking only to what I know of U.S. grants. I know it's a little bit different in different countries, but one challenge with getting grant funding for sort of this research and this aspect of development is that a lot of grants don't actually fund development per se, at least in our experience and our research on that so far. And you know, they'll fund the research itself. And so if you partner with a researcher, then there's a potential for collaboration there. But the actual development, you know, it's challenging to get grant funding for that. Additionally, a lot of grants just move very slowly. So you could apply and not potentially hear anything back for a year later, which if you're a tiny development studio, is essentially a lifetime. So it's been a challenge for us, and it continues to be. I don't have any suggestions or answers to it yet, but I can say that other studios have managed to find success with this. It can be done. I'm not saying that this is impossible. It's just it's a little bit more difficult than ideally it should be. But I'm hoping that that's improving, and that this is something that will be less of a challenge for developers, you know, in the coming years. Great. So all of this is to say that in my experience with developing Nevermind, creating games for mental health has its unique and sometimes not so unique challenges, but it really is very doable, and it's definitely worth it. Nevermind is still a work in progress in my eyes, and I think it always will be. And we're learning new things every day, so I don't have all the answers, and I'm still trying to figure a lot of things out. But I do want to say that in my experience, here is, I guess, my biggest piece of humble advice for those who are looking to explore developing games for mental health, whether it's something that will promote wellness or something that will educate players or something that does both, is that you should absolutely do it. It makes the game more interesting, and it really isn't as hard as you think. You know, I think if you know, I would recommend working with experts. Doing so will always make the game better, and it will ensure that you achieve your goals and will help prevent you from accidentally doing more harm than good. And what's really cool about that is if you're working with experts outside of game development, it's a great opportunity to meet a lot of cool people that you may have not met otherwise, so it's a good opportunity to make new friends. And again, if you're thinking about incorporating mental health themes into a commercial game, and that's awesome, just keep in mind that you are making a game and you're not making a textbook or an infomercial. You should really use your superpowers as a game designer, game developer to make it an awesome experience for the end user first and foremost, and then don't beat yourself up if you can't incorporate every single fact, tidbit, piece of knowledge known to man about that area of mental health. Just make sure that what you do represent is authentic and respectful, and I think you can find a lot of success in that. So again, it's it's not, it may seem like a daunting task, but it really, it's a very, it's an interesting creative challenge and a very doable one. And I really, really do encourage and challenge all of you game designers and developers out there to really think about how your game might promote wellness and help educate players about an aspect of mental health, because I think any game that has the capacity to be, or any game potentially has the capacity to be a wellness game. Even if the game itself isn't all about mental health topics, or if the main focus it isn't to instill wellness in the player, any game can still have elements of these. Whether you're trying to make a game to teach anger management skills or a game that has a character with anger management issues, all of the above are valuable tips, since both have the potential to leave the player with well, new insight and perspective that can help the player, help players themselves, or help players be a little bit more understanding of those around them. So, you know, some might say, is there any evidence to support that games can positively impact players in such a way? And I do think that many of us as game developers and players intuitively know that this is the case. But there's also a lot of growing research out there that implies this to be the case as well. So with all that, it is my hope that more games intended to either teach and or help foster mental wellness are developed, that more research on amazing impact, the amazing impact that these games can have on individuals and society is funded and performed, and that all of us, whether it's through games or any other means, are able to understand a little bit more about ourselves and about others. So that's it. And I made this question slide because I wasn't sure if there'd be immediate questions afterwards, but we're going to do it as a collective group. So that's the end of that.
Thank you very much, Aaron. And thank you very much, Kristen, Jacob, and everyone who presented today. If there are any questions, please feel free to shoot them over to us. We'll probably have a few minutes left for those. Otherwise, we can be, please feel free to reach out to us online. The webinar itself and the slides will be available in a few weeks at the IGDA's YouTube channel, which is listed as youtube.com/the-IGDA. Simple enough to remember, I think. And please, if any of you have any suggestions for topics you're interested in or something you may want to present yourself, let us know. We'd be more than happy to try and facilitate something. Okay. So, last call for questions then? Okay. All right. Well, seeing none, thank you very much once again for everyone who attended today, everyone who had to go, everyone who presented. I hope you enjoyed this and that you come to our next event. Have a good evening and a good night wherever you are in the world.